Hi, this lecture is on rehabilitation, and as soon as I can get this to go down, I will, there we go, switch pages. The definition of rehabilitation, at least from Wilson, is interventions that are nice, benevolent, or well-intended, or that involve the provision of special services. It's kind of a definition that I would describe as more deterrence oriented. Like you either, his definition makes it sound like there is no purpose other than to be nice. I think the National Research Council's definition is a little better, and that is a result of any planned intervention that reduces further criminal activity, whether that reduction is mediated by personality, behavior, abilities, attitudes, values, or other factors. And that seems to be kind of the standard definition. The idea is rehabilitation, or even habilitation in some parts, is to provide a focus on the things that might make a person not successful in a pro-social society. So how do we do this? We first had Robert Martinson's, which we talked about already in class, his influence on rehabilitation. And if you remember that during the 60s and early 70s, we had both liberals and conservatives basically arguing that rehabilitation was either coerced or it wasn't working. And Robert Martinson's article really kind of gave more fuel to the fire, so to speak, as far as throwing out the attempts at rehabilitation. And so his famous line is, with few and isolated exceptions, the rehabilitative efforts that have been reported so far have had no appreciable effect on recidivism. Ultimately, Frank Collin, you've read Collin and Gilbert, basically said that the idea that rehabilitation didn't work really sparked criminologists to really do very strict scientific research. And so when we do social research, when we look at programs, that today we're looking at what works and what doesn't work based on sound scientific methods. So the research efforts really began, Cullen's call that ultimately, we don't want to really throw out rehabilitation, but maybe if you believe in rehabilitation, you should study it more. And it really began in the 80s. Surprisingly, some of the leading authors, other than Frank Collin himself and Ed Latessa, were Canadian researchers, Don Andrews, James Bonta, and Paul Gendreau. And they started really reevaluating Martinson's work and found out that some of the programs did reduce recidivism. And this is all through methodological means that they were finding out. But the more they studied programs, and they wrote a book, it's called The Psychology of Criminal Conduct, which is kind of the Bible for a lot of people on looking at crime and the psychological effects of it. They found some very interesting things the more they studied programs. And one is that cognitive behavioral interventions were more effective than others. So one of the things that was missing from Martinson's analysis were cognitive or behavioral programs. So they weren't even included in his original study. Second is the debate of whether or not prison is the right environment, and they came up that a natural environment, which would be your community setting, would be much more effective. Using multiple methods rather than one prescribed method. One program does not fit all, and that's what multimodal is. And that the program itself, or the programs, are sufficiently intensive. One of the things that we have to do is, and we'll talk about that briefly, is reinforce pro-social behavior. 6, that you need to target high risk, high criminogenic needs. And we'll discuss this in a minute. And finally, you have to match the learning styles and characteristics of the offender, as well as the ability of the offender, to the program. So Collin and Johnson, and this was 2012, so this is a little later, but after all the research that came out in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, really laid down that there were 4 principles of effective intervention. So if you're going to do rehabilitation, you want to do it so it's effective. So 1, treatment should target high-risk offenders, and this is the risk principle. I'll talk about it in just a bit. Treatment should focus on the criminogenic or crime-producing needs of the offender, and this is the needs principle. Treatment should be cognitive behavioral in nature, which is the general response that we should do. And other considerations must be taken into account, which is specific responsivity, such as staff training, the offender's culture, the environment that you're trying to do this in. And so as we move on, we start with what is referred to as R&R, and this is coming from Andrews and Bonta and Gendreau. And because they identified these things, then they developed what we refer to as risk, needs, and responsivity model. And these are the things that this is the framework for an effective program. Now, first we have to identify that there are 2 types of risk factors. There are dynamic risk factors, and these are the factors that can change. There are acute factors that can change relatively quick. Like, for example, someone could be unemployed but could get a job, and then the next day they're employed. So that's quick. Somebody could be by themselves, and then they meet somebody that's pro-social and they're in a relationship. So that's quick. And the last one are the second one is stable, which ultimately are dynamic factors that can change, but it takes more time and effort. So I would think that, when we look at drug addiction, that's going to take some time to get over. It's not going to be, okay, well, I'm addicted to a drug, tomorrow I won't be. The second kind of risk factor is static, and these are risk factors that we cannot change. So when we look at a person concentrating on their prior offenses, that's never going to change. We have to look at the present and the future. One of the big risk factors is being male. They can't change that. Age. Younger people tend to commit more crime. And then past drug and alcohol use. We want to concentrate on the present. So in order for a program to be effective, obviously it needs to concentrate on those dynamic factors. So the risk principle then states that ultimately there are risk factors, and the research continually keeps coming up with the same answer, which means that it validates that these risk factors are the most frequently seen in pro-criminal behavior. The first and probably the strongest one we have is antisocial pro-criminal attitudes. So somebody that displays antisocial characteristics and then justifies what they do with pro-criminal attitudes, has values and beliefs and what we refer to as cognitive emotional states, which they think that the law is crap, the cops are bad, the criminal justice system's rigged. It also then goes into how they feel about conventional institutions, like example, work. And it's interesting that there's been some studies that there's one study that did of burglars, and they referred to people that went to work as suckers. that work 9 to 5 because they thought that, by burglarizing, they could get money quick and easy. So again, that would be, having a negative expression about a conventional institution. And then self-management of behavior. Most people, we all get mad at other people, but we don't react physically or even a lot of times verbally. You just kind of bite your tongue and walk away. One of the things we see is that negative expression is about that self-management of behavior, that they think that that's okay. I've listened to offenders, basically tell me that, well, this is how it's going to be. You say something I don't like, I'm going to punch you. And which really becomes part of what cognitive restructuring is all about. And one of the last things that they mention, this negative expression, is the inability to have empathy or sensitivity towards others. So ultimately, you are placed first, a narcissistic personality that the world revolves around you. Second, then, obviously, if you have pro-criminal attitudes, then you probably are going to hang around people that believe in it. So you're going to have pro-criminal associates, and a lot of times you are isolated from what they call anti-criminal others, but I'm going to say pro-social others. Who do you hang around with? This is a basis of, if you remember social learning theory, that, those that create the definitions, the majority of definitions is usually the path you follow. So if you're only hanging around pro-criminal associates, you really don't have anyone challenging those attitudes and ultimately sticking up for pro-social ideas. 3, the third risk factor is temperamental and personality factors that are conducive to criminal activity. Psychopathy is one. Weak socialization, where you really aren't bonded to society, and so you just kind of drift, and so you don't see any responsibility to be pro-social to the society. Impulsivity, where you're quick to make judgments. What I would say is a lot of times impulsive people make a decision without thinking about it. And then what they refer to as restless or aggressive energy. People that constantly have to be on the go or constantly read the messages coming to them. They read others' actions in that negative expression. And so their response is always through aggression. That's how, like disrespect. A lot of inmates will talk about you can't disrespect them. And so they see that as a large affront. Egocentrism is really, they see the world from themselves out. And so when you only focus on yourself, it not only affects your empathy towards others, but it also distances you from understanding how your actions have consequences and how far-reaching those consequences are. We find that many offenders have below average verbal intelligence. A lot of this comes usually from the dysfunction of the family and the environment that they grow up in. One of the things that we notice with a lot of lower class individuals is the lack of talking to their children. They usually give commands. So as I always say, go to Walmart on Saturday and listen to how parents are interacting with their children. A lot of times I would refer to it as grandstanding. If they're doing what would be pro-socially acceptable, they're doing it loudly so other people can hear. But in most cases, you see parents giving commands, like one short sentences. Get over here. Stop touching that. In other words, they are not talking to their children. They're basically one-wording it. And so if you go back to infancy and toddlerhood and parents aren't involving the child in conversations to help them, one would expect that they would have lower verbal intelligence. So How does this affect children? Well, think about when they start to school. If you haven't really been exposed to anything, and we can go something very simple like that you don't know numbers because parents haven't taught you anything, and other students know numbers, then all of a sudden you're at a disadvantage. So this includes your ability to understand the language, but also to speak the language. And so it has a tremendous effect over time. Another temperament and personality factor is having a taste for risk. Have you ever known somebody that always does risky things, wants you to put yourself in danger? And sometimes we admire these people, but most of the time, at least for me personally, it gets a little scary. I always think of like people who ultimately like do all these risky things. Like when I was growing up, it was Evel Knievel. And you're surprised, that somebody would put themselves at such risk just for the thrill of it. Well, what we find with offenders is that this taste for risk is always there, and initial criminal activity involves that risk. And then you keep upping it because, something small, let's say like shoplifting, a candy bar, the risk was there, but then once you accomplish that, you might want a bigger risk. So what this usually leads to is a lot of behaviors that juveniles participate in before they're really ready. Like, for example, drinking, doing drugs, smoking cigarettes, having sex early, having many partners. In other words, that pro-social break is not there for them. And then finally, they list weak problem solving and self-regulation skills. One of the things that I had read a long time ago was that one of the things that a lot of our offenders lack is the ability to cope with stress. And partly it's because the environment that they grow up in. But the other part is because they're not very good problem solvers. And I'm not sure, I haven't read a lot of literature on problem solving, but I think that probably parental intervention helps us solve problems. So if you have parents that always gave you like a scenario and then what would you do? Or they give you a choice where you have to think out, well, here's the action, mom and dad are giving me a choice of two things. What's going to happen long term? Which one's the better choice? I don't think that this is something that we see a lot in our lower class people, probably because problem solving skills get cut short by using other more physical means. So someone disrespects you, you punch them. So that is self-regulation, where you literally respond more emotionally and physically. So we're going backwards on this video. There we go. The risk principle is, the fourth one is a history of antisocial behavior. And ultimately, if you look at the characteristics of antisocial behavior, you can go AKA criminal behavior. Usually we see antisocial behavior, the tooth pass, according to Moffat, but the one that we're talking about, criminal, is that could lead to like career criminality, are behaviors that start at a young age. So some of those behaviors: impulsivity, aggressiveness, risk-taking, lying, deceitfulness. Those type of antisocial characteristics start very early on. And we do know from the literature that if somebody is overly aggressive early on, chances are that will continue all the way through adulthood. It's one of those bad variables. But one of the things that really sets off antisocial behavior is that it happens in a variety of settings. I always laugh that when I've had teenagers, particularly my daughter, a lot of times, there were a lot of arguments at home. She wanted her way. It wasn't going to happen that way. But then she would go to school and, her teachers would all say she was delightful. And I was thinking, gee, do they have their kids mixed up? But ultimately, what happens is that many times you see different behaviors based on different settings. So if you're in the school setting, she basically acted differently and appropriately. Home was where she could unwind and apparently take it out on her parents. But she also then had a job and she followed what was expected at work. And we could even add in going to church there. The difference is antisocial behavior. Those people don't recognize the differences of how we should act in different settings, so that their behavior happens in all settings. And it involves a number and variety of different acts. In other words, the young person might kick another student, might bite another student, might steal from the teacher's purse. In other words, they're not crime specific. They ultimately commit deviant acts in a variety of ways at kind of a regular pace in all settings. 5, family factors. Having a parent that's criminal. Research shows male criminality stronger than female, but more research is being done to show that really both parents having criminal factors affects the kids. Having psychological problems within the family. So you have a parent that's depressed, so therefore that parent is not supervising a young child. It ultimately then leads to not only more free time for the child to be deviant, but it also affects affection levels. And we know that it is so important early on to bond with a child and to supervise and monitor that child's behavior. And so if the parents have psychological problems, including alcohol and substance abuse, then it affects affection, caring, and cohesiveness of the family. And then I said poor parental supervision. Poor discipline practices. We find that fair and consistent is the best. But we have one of the things that I noticed, particularly in lower class, again, my Walmart experiment, is that punishment is very severe, very authoritative in a lot of lower class families, which is a negative result on behavior. Discipline practices also, if they're inconsistent, where you have a parent one day ignoring the behavior, one day maybe rewarding the behavior, and the next day beating the kid for the same behavior. Those inconsistencies really affect a child. And ultimately, outright neglect and abuse. I would kind of wrap up this family factors and say that really more and more we're finding out that early on childhood maltreatment, whether it be psychological, physical, or sexual in nature, and that would include neglect, really sets a child on a path that, if not intervened, that ultimately can lead to deviant behavior. And it's the more research we do, the more profound these first few years mean in the development of a child. And then 6 is low levels of personal, educational, vocational, and financial achievement. Ultimately, it starts on a path that these people don't have too much success at anything. You come from a dysfunctional family, so you don't have a bond with them. You go to school, you're behind because your family hasn't taught you anything, and you're behind before you even start. No one's there to help you with your ABCs. No one's there to teach you your numbers. So you're already outside what would be considered the average learning curve. Vocational, learning a skill that you could survive on. A lot of these people end up not participating in anything. And then as they get older, they don't have financial achievement because they don't have the education or the vocational or even what the personality to get employed and stay employed so that they can actually have financial success. 7, risk factor, low levels of involvement in pro-social leisure activities. Ultimately, if you don't participate in pro-social activities, then you're not countered against anything. And I would say that it gives you more idle time. You hang around people that are antisocial, and it really limits your, I guess, your conscience from really having that debate of whether or not to go antisocial, pro-social. So think about violent neighborhoods where there's very little pro-social activity. There's very little countering from like businesses. We don't see businesses there. That the less you're involved in what I would say society, the more likely you are to then align with antisocial behavior. And finally is substance abuse. One, the book says, is illicit activity. Depends, now in Michigan, marijuana is legal. But at least I want to qualify this. What you see is when we talk about abuse, and I'm not talking about addiction, but that substances become part of the normal living. So as you're, for example, in college, you've probably all been exposed to drinking. And so it becomes part of the college life, maybe to drink on weekends. Maybe there are, parties on Friday nights, and Saturday, maybe there's sporting events and then parties after them. When I went to college, Thursday night was a big night, and then Saturday night was a big night. And so people participated in these activities because everybody else was participating in it. And ultimately, I would really, even though that people were using substances and maybe some were abusing them at that time, if we looked at the pattern of behavior, it wasn't a regular thing. When we're looking at the risk factor, we're looking more of a consistent pattern of using it. So start out, you have kids that start out very young smoking cigarettes. So smoking cigarettes is like an everyday activity. There's very few people who smoke who say, well, I'm only going to smoke on Friday. And then they're introduced, whether it be to drinking or drugs. And drinking and drugs becomes part of their normal activity during the week. And so that substance abuse, then you ultimately have to have friends around you or, relatives, family around you that also participate on, a daily basis. And so it only promotes antisocial behavior. And it also impacts your other social skills. So think about it. If you were sitting next to somebody in class and they said, hey, would you like to go grab a drink? You might say yes. But the next day you're sitting in class and they say, hey, let's go grab a drink. And every time you go to grab a drink with them, they drink like in excess. And you say, well, I can't go. I have to work this week. Well, no, come on, go grab a drink. Ultimately, it impacts your social skills because pro-social people don't want to hang around with people that are literally on a path of destruction. So if you need to review, these 8 factors are on page 22 of your Latessa et al. Book. I should have put the pages in, but I didn't. Okay, one of the things how do offenders then, we've identified some of the risks. Well, how do they then counter pro-social methods? And we talked about this in Nature of Crime. If you haven't had Nature of Crime, we will talk about it. But most offenders minimize or neutralize their behavior, particularly not only what they've done, but what they've done to others. So Sykes and Matza back in the 50s, I think, might have been 60s, wrote about neutralization techniques, that people aren't into crime all the time, but when they do, they kind of neutralize their involvement and they act more pro-socially so that they think that they're accepted. So the first one is denial of responsibility, where they basically say, well, yeah, it was a criminal act, but it was on my control. And I use the one that I heard the most when I was working with inmates is, well, I was drunk. And I always used to say to them, well, you know what? I've been drunk too, but I've never thought of doing a burglary. So ultimately, it becomes an excuse for they had to be thinking about burglary before they were drunk. Denial of injury. You might admit responsibility for the act, but you minimize the harm you did. So I had a kid that was a burglar, and he said, well, what's the big deal? They have insurance. In other words, yeah, I stole from this person. I created fear in the person, which didn't mean anything. I took their merchandise, which was their money. But what's the big deal? They have insurance, so they can get it back. The third one is denial of a victim. They blame the victim for the crime. And we see this a lot with rape and sex offenses. She flirted with me, or when it's domestic abuse, she knew not to nag me. In other words, the other person brings on the crime. Condemnation of the condemners is really bashing the system, that the system's out to get them. Like, everyone uses drugs, I just got caught. Or the cops are dirty. Or I didn't do anything, I was set up. And finally, appealing to higher loyalties, where they say they live by a different code. So you see this with a lot of deviant people is, whether it be in a gang, I stand up for what the gang says over what would be a good thing to do for me. I had to stand up for my brother. In other words, they now have a bigger loyalty to something outside of following the law. So I've gone through risk factors, and I've gone through some techniques of how deviant people are able to do those risk factors and not feel guilty. So we come back down to that risk principle. So we're looking at the risk factors. How do we find them? And so that's through the use of validated assessments. And there's a few that are mentioned in the book. The more an instrument is used and comes up reliable and valid, the more likely we are going to find that it does show the consistency, which is the reliability, and it ultimately helps predict what we're looking for. So if we're looking for risk factors, then we want to give questions that will get to the bottom of them. So some of the things, I just used the LSI, and I think it's the LSIR, is one of the bigger ones used in corrections. It measures dynamic and static risk factors, more so the dynamic. And it has 10 domains that cover different areas of the person's life. Ohio Risk Assessment System was developed by Latessa and his colleagues. And there's different models of it that ultimately, one's for pretrial, like when the courts to decide like probation, also to decide bail decisions, stuff like that. There's a community supervision if somebody gets probation. There's a prison intake tool, and then there's a reentry tool for people on parole to see whether or not they are a risk factor to the community. So I did mention, and this is, I'm not trying to steal my colleagues' thunder on talking about methods and statistics, but what happens with an assessment, and that's the word we use, or a survey that we give them that they have to answer questions, is we look for reliability and validity. And so it takes a while for instruments to be validated, and they have to be used over and tweaked a lot to make sure that they're measuring what they're supposed to. So you want to, in order to really do the risk principle, is use a validated assessment. So what we do with these assessments is they predict future behavior, or they predict criminal behavior, maybe recidivism, and then it helps us then match interventions that would help that type of offender. The research is pretty solid on showing that you get the biggest bang for your buck by focusing on high-risk offenders. And those high-risk offenders coming from the assessment have probably the farthest to go as far as learning pro-social behavior. What we have found is that sometimes when we get low-risk offenders and we put them in programs, it actually makes them worse, because low-risk offenders do have a lot of stakes in pro-social society, and then you're exposing them to criminal attitudes, or you're ultimately making them do things that won't help them other than make them angry. So one of the things when we look at the risk principle is what is needed for these high-risk offenders, and we want to provide what's referred to as intensive treatment. The book uses the word dosage, and if you should have at least 100 hours of a program for moderate risk, and 200 hours plus for high risk or moderate risk with multiple needs. So somebody might be moderate risk, let's say that they have a job, but they're also a drug addict and they participate in a gang. So there's multiple needs there, even though probably the employment might make them moderate risk compared to high risk. So that's what it means by multiple needs. Duration is how long the program lasts, and I will talk about the change program and how it was in stages and weeks, enough that the big thing is the time enough for the offenders to understand and comprehend, practice, and then ultimately change their behavior. And is there a follow-up or something that revisits what they've learned so that it's fresh in their mind? The need principle is what criminogenic risk factors should we target. So we identify what the risk factors are, and then the research shows that we should target 4 to 6 risk factors. If we do this, 31% reduction in recidivism. And they have to target the dynamic factors. So here's an example that the book used. You have somebody that's high risk because of unemployment, and they have an attitude that working is for fools and believes that they can make easy money selling drugs. So not only are we targeting the fact that they're unemployment, which would be an acute dynamic factor, but now they have these criminal attitudes and beliefs and values of why they don't want to work. They've justified that they've found a shortcut method, and that then they've also psychologically labeled people that do this as that ultimately that they're not cool. So you have to deal with multi-risk factors in order to take care of the one risk factor. And that's really the importance. So ultimately, the needs principle is trying to focus on those factors that really interfere with pro-social behavior. Responsivity principle is, okay, we've now identified the risk factors. We look at what this person needs, and what their criminogenic needs are. And so the response is then, how are we going to deal with this? So the general one is most offenders respond to interventions based on structured social learning and cognitive behavioral approaches. So I'm not going to go into detail about both of these. I might talk a little bit about cognitive behavioral, but we've talked about social learning and nature of crime, and ultimately that we learn behaviors through others. And so how do we unlearn behaviors? Through others. And we'll talk about cognitive meaning thinking. Specific responsibility is the treatment should be tailored to the individual's characteristics that ultimately will impact their success. So really what it means is matching offenders to programs based on their own learning styles, but also their own belief system. So one of the things that we're seeing more and more is literature, the research is showing that drug groups, when you have drug treatment groups, should be based, the sexes should be separated, that they should have a women's group and a men's group. Because what happens when they have mixed groups, women tend not to speak up. They're kind of intimidated, or they're trying to present that the best foot forward, and it interferes with the actual programming. So ultimately matching offenders to programs based on learning style. So if you have a female offender that you're working with, you want to find programs that deal specifically with females. Okay, so one of the things that sets behavioral programs apart from others is it focuses on the present. They are action-oriented rather than talk-oriented, and the techniques that are there to model and reinforce appropriate behavior. In other words, it's not just about, well, you should do this. What social learning and cognitive behavioral approaches do is they say, okay, here's a skill, let's practice it. And you practice it so that you learn how to actually do that skill. I'll talk about that in a minute. Here's some necessary ingredients for change that we should look at. And the first is the facilitator qualities. Ultimately, in order to get offenders to even buy into treatment, you have to have program staff that they can relate to and develop a rapport with. And so staff characteristics, and this is so important, the people have to be open and to the possibility that they're going to change. They've got to be able to show that they care about what the offender is going to do. They respect the offender. And they are motivated and they're pro-social themselves. And they're knowledgeable about the offender and their behaviors and attitudes. One of the big things that I learned very early on is creating a reputation about yourself, that you're fair, you're consistent, and then people respond, and that you're reliable. I used to, if an inmate put in, we called them request slips. In Michigan, they call them kites. If an inmate put in a kite to see me, I went to see him. So they knew if they were my caseload, that if they put in a kite, I would come and see him. It wasn't like a guessing system. And so what happened compared to some of the other counselors is my clients would only put in request slips when they needed them. The other people, because the person never came, they would always put in request slips every day, just hoping that the person would come. It saved me a lot of time in the end. Big thing is that the facilitators must be trained to effectively implement the program. And that includes buying into what the program's about. In fact, the research shows that it should be all the way up. You need supervisors to buy into the program as well. And you've got to be trained in a manner that you know how to successfully implement the program. Some other necessary ingredients for change, and there's a whole section in Latessa's book. So if you're working in the field, or if you're working or going to be working in the field about reinforcers and stuff, I highly suggest keeping this book and then rereading that section, because it'll give you some ideas. And reinforcers are things that kind of make a big deal about good behavior and bad behavior. And so one way is through effective praise, and that's noting pro-social behavior when it happens. And then using effective disapproval. Again, if somebody does something that is not pro-social, that you call them out on it, but in a way where it's not considered a stumbling block. And then how do you use your authority? You don't want to use your authority except if you need it. And so they do give some good tips. Some other necessary ingredients really come down to implementation. You have to follow whatever program you're using's design. And I'll talk about this in 2 seconds. You use reinforcements and sanctions that are appropriate for that aren't going to penalize the person. We know punishment doesn't really work. So we want to use sanctions appropriately, that they're not going to be too discouraging to the offender and the progress that they're making. You want to have policies and procedures in place of what's going to happen, not only with the implementation, but within the program. And sometimes those policies and procedures are developed because something you didn't think of happens. But ultimately, if you're going in to do a program, you should have policies and procedures. You should document and track everything that goes on, which literally leads to evaluation. And I'm surprised that they didn't list this. You document and track everything so you can evaluate it, so that you can find out what is wrong and what you need to tweak. And finally, staff training. That training has to be thorough enough that you can trust your staff to follow the design exactly. So some of the other issues that we found, and some of these are pretty much through the research, is we find with behavioral programs that cognitive ability does come into play. People with lower IQ sometimes can't understand the concepts, particularly when it comes to behavioral restructuring. And so it's difficult to get them to be successful in that type of program. Mental health. Is there a mental health issue that stands in the way? And sometimes because it's reoccurring or co-occurring with the deviancy, that this might need to be taken care of first before you can really try to be successful in a program. Personality, we find that most criminals are extroverts. They might lean towards psychotic. Some are neurotic. Remember, I talked about negative affectivity, where everything's seen as a negative, and then low self-control. Another thing that's becoming more and more is understanding and incorporating trauma-based treatment into the program. More and more child maltreatment, the trauma that comes from that, violence. All these things really affect how the child sees the real world. And then demographics and cultural characteristics. So I talked about demographics, male, female, but we also have race, ethnicity, where they come from, what's acceptable and what isn't. So, for example, Mexican men have a difficult time listening to Mexican women because their culture literally places the women below men. So it would be difficult if you had an Hispanic female running, let's say, a drug treatment group where you had Hispanic men, because right away that cultural characteristic is going to get in the way of the treatment. one of the things that I talk about in my article, but also Latessa talks about in his book, is the motivation to change by Prochaska DiClemente. Started in 1983. They've written about it several times. But basically, that motivation is not you're either motivated or not. A lot of times it's really on kind of a sliding scale. That at the pre-contemplation stage, you might not even realize you have a problem, but the people around you recognize you have a problem. Where contemplation is, yeah, I think that this is a problem, but whether or not you're going to do anything remains seen. And one of the things that we found in our research is that this contemplation was very apparent in the people that had gone into involuntarily into the change program, that there were certain issues that they saw that made it more difficult. And if you read the article, some talked about anger, some talked about authority. So they were able to recognize characteristics that were standing in their way. Now, that doesn't mean that they wanted to do anything about it, but they did recognize it. And that's that contemplation stage. And then the next stage is where they say, well, maybe I really need to address this. And then they take action. And ultimately, how do they maintain that? Is the maintenance stage. So then you read my article, and I'll just be brief on it. What I wanted to point out, a little different than the article and some of the things that went on, is it really shows how important the integrity of the program was. So the change program happened at the Michigan Reformatory. It was an involuntary program for high-risk inmates that was defined by their misconduct within the prison and their security level. So they had to have, so you'll have to read the article, so many points to even be considered. And the security level also combined what their charge was, and then the misconduct kept making the security level go up. So we only targeted really high-risk inmates. And the cognitive change program, we called it change, but it was really cognitive behavioral restructuring, had 3 phases. And the first phase, they were involuntarily committed to because of their high-risk behavior. And the program was supposed to it was supposed to be 8 weeks for that first phase. Then they went to a second phase, which was voluntary. And then the third phase, which they never got to because it was supposed to be, and they might be doing it now, it was supposed to be once they got out of prison, they would continue to do a cognitive behavioral program. And so this was just one part of our research. I had done interviews and asked them different things about the program and had questions that I could ultimately test whether or not the involuntary treatment was standing in the way. And what we noticed was that most of the inmates, the majority of the inmates, were angry that they got placed into the program because many of them had to change locations because it was at the reformatory, which is like one of the oldest institutions in Michigan. And some of them were coming from brand new facilities. It affected their visiting, it affected family, it affected their status as far as how comfortable they felt. So, as I said, it would be normal for them not to want to get in this program. But one of the things then we wanted to look at is based on some of the concepts that they were teaching in this first phase, were they catching on and then were they applying them? And what we did find is, that it was just starting to work. Now, most admitted that they wouldn't have signed up if they hadn't been forced, which really, I think, is the mantra of most high-risk inmates. They're not going to participate unless you force them. Some of the things that we learned, though, is that going back to the integrity of the program, and this starts, when responsivity is there were some supervisors that were not on board. In fact, we had a captain send out a memo to everybody that they weren't writing them up enough. We had officers that weren't on board because they had tried to get involved in the program and they weren't selected, so they were angry, and so they basically were harder on the change inmates than they were on the general population. One of the big things that affected our research was, as I said, the program was supposed to be the first phase 8 weeks. Well, because they had some changes in who was the resident unit manager at the time. Back then they called them RUMs. That the next one that came in wasn't really committed to the program and felt that the counselors and the officers were having too much time in between groups. So they wanted him to run the groups. Well, we didn't find this out until the end when we were calculating when they took the pre-test and when they took the post-test. And we were finding out these people, instead of being in that first phase for 8 weeks, some of them were in it only for 3 weeks because they accelerated everything. And the question really was, how could one change or even understand and change behavior in 3 weeks? And the answer is they couldn't. So the part of the lack of evidence for this program was originally affected by implementation and then decisions made that we weren't even aware of. Ultimately, we found because of the stages of change that really that initial stage should be lengthened to accommodate the people who are going to be pissed at the beginning, and it might take a little longer for them to start to buy into the program. And so ultimately, that is what we have learned today. More and more research, when you have a program, it's evaluated to see if it's effective, who it's going to be effective for. And so going back to the Get Tough movement, it really sparked criminologists to really study and to create and evaluate programs extensively. And that's it.